The Old West has long been wrapped in myths of rugged cowboys, heroic lawmen, and dusty towns where legends were born. Behind those images, though, daily life was brutally harsh and unforgiving. Survival meant enduring extremes of weather, lawless violence, widespread disease, and a near total lack of comfort or safety nets. Death was common, fear was constant, and even simple necessities like clean water or basic medicine were far from guaranteed. In a world where danger came from every direction, nature, neighbors, and even trusted authorities, most people today, accustomed to stability and protection, would struggle to last even a single day. Number 1. The noise and the madness. The real Old West ran on clamor. Hammer on anvil rhythms from blacksmith forges, saw blades whining through green timber at mills, stamp batteries pounding ore day and night in mining camps, iron-rimmed wagon wheels grating over plank sidewalks and hard-pan streets, locomotive whistles splitting the air as cattle trains coupled and jolted in stockyard towns. Saloons layered piano jangle over shouted bets, clacking chips, and the scrape of chair legs. Upstairs, floorboards groaned under dancers' boots, while below, spittoons rang like bells when someone missed. Church bells, fire bells, and town alarms cut through at odd hours, joined by bugle calls from forts and the steady chatter of telegraph keys in depots. Herds moving through trailhead markets added bawling cattle, cracking whips, and the sharp reports of blanks fired to scatter a surge. Buildings of raw pine and false fronts amplified everything. Narrow streets and false ceilings bounced sound back in waves, turning a single quarrel into town-wide racket. Nights offered no real relief. Dance halls stayed open, freight wagons arrived after dark to avoid heat, and celebratory gunfire weddings, paydays, Independence Day peppered the sky, sending echoes down alleys. Barking dogs set off chain reactions with mules and horses, and the ever-present wind hissed through board seams, rattling shutters and signage. Constant noise intersected with stresses that modern ears rarely endure. Sulfur and charcoal smoke from black powder lingering like a throat irritant. Tannery vats, livery stables, and slaughter sheds contributing heavy odors that made saloons feel louder because conversation had to ride over the stench. Civil War veterans carried startle reflexes into crowded rooms where slammed doors or dropped bottles sounded like incoming fire. A hair-trigger nervous system meeting an environment designed to jolt it. Sleep deprivation followed. Thin walls, communal bunks, and roadhouse lofts above bar rooms fractured rest into brief snatches, and dawn returned the anvils, whistles, and roosters. Merchants complained about nervous headache. Editors wrote of distemper among teamsters, and doctors labeled the condition everything from neurasthenia to plain drunken irritability. But the engine driving it was the same saturation of sound. In such towns, attention frayed, tempers shortened, and ordinary misunderstandings escalated quickly because voices were already raised and hands already tense. A spilled drink or a misheard word inside that acoustic pressure cooker became hazard more than slight, and the day's work played out against a drumline that never truly stopped. Number 2. Whiskey as currency. On the frontier, coins and paper money were in short supply and often distrusted, so whiskey effectively became the closest thing to cash traded for meals, mended wagons, a night's lodging, even a parcel of land. That gave a bottle of rotgut more power than gold, because unlike official coinage, it passed instantly between pockets with no questions asked. But this wasn't polished bourbon. It was harsh. Homemade liquor sometimes cut with turpentine, tobacco juice, or even gunpowder to punch through low spirits or tainted water. It burned going down, corroded throats, wrecked stomach linings, and in some cases led to partial blindness. Yet in towns where waterborne diseases were common and coffee was costly, it became a necessary risk, a crude remedy against dehydration or infection. Saloon keepers stocked barrels not just to get customers drunk, but because whiskey was stable safer to carry than flour or salted meat, and easy to barter. Drinking became both occupational hazard and lifeline. Dependency spread like wildfire, and many people were crippled more by addiction than by injuries or disease. Violence followed. A spilled drink, a refused shot, A bar fight over a cheap steak escalated into gunplay faster than in civilized settings because whiskey blurred judgment, amplified tempers, and blurred the line between hospitality and hostility. Proven outlaw gangs sometimes took barrels of whiskey as proof of goodwill or ransom, using them to grease deals with local businessmen or lawmen. Trying to buy someone's loyalty with dollars rarely worked, but a jug of strong liquor usually did. In such a world, declining a drink could be perceived as insult or mistrust, and reputations were built or destroyed over what people raised at the rim, often an open invitation to disaster. People who arrived expecting a measured barroom culture, the kind of polite clink of glasses familiar today, would quickly discover a brutal environment where whiskey was both coin and weapon, diplomacy and destruction, and misjudgment fueled by intoxication turned more lives upside down than any gunfight. Number 3. Medicine that killed more than it cured. Frontier medicine in the American West reflected a world where scientific understanding was still primitive, doctors were scarce, and desperation often outweighed caution. Physicians carried surgical saws and bone forceps not as last resort tools, but as routine instruments, because amputation was frequently the only response to fractures or gunshot wounds. Without antiseptics or an understanding of germ theory ideas that would only gain wider acceptance after Joseph Lister's publications in the late 19th century, every incision risked infection. A splintered leg might be cut off within hours, simply to prevent gangrene, and the patient's survival depended more on chance than skill. Anesthesia was rudimentary at best. Ether and chloroform existed, but were rare and dangerous to administer without training, so patients were often given whiskey to dull the pain, or told to bite down on leather straps. Dental care was even more brutal. Toothaches, abscesses, and rotting gums were common, but rural towns seldom had trained dentists, so extractions were done with pliers or chisels. Many people suffered broken jaws or lingering infections that spread through the bloodstream. Medicine itself could be more lethal than the injuries it tried to treat. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was prescribed for everything from headaches to insomnia and became a common household remedy. Morphine, delivered in crude syringes, was widely used by Civil War veterans and civilians alike, creating a generation of addicts who were never recognized as such because dependency wasn't yet understood as a medical condition. Mercury-based pills and tonics promised to purify the system, but led to poisoning, neurological damage, and even death. Calomel, a mercury chloride compound, was especially notorious for rotting gums and teeth while destroying the digestive tract. Bloodletting, a practice already outdated in Europe, lingered in frontier communities, with physicians draining pints from weakened patients on the belief that it balanced humors. Herbal poultices were also applied, sometimes mixed with lard or animal fat, but these mixtures attracted flies and worsened wounds. Childbirth was one of the greatest hazards. With little access to trained midwives or sterile environments, maternal and infant mortality rates were staggering. Women often prepared farewell letters before going into labor because death was so common. Improvised tools, contaminated cloth, and untreated infections turned what should have been new beginnings into community tragedies. Cemeteries across the West filled with markers for young mothers and infants, stark reminders that reproduction itself was often fatal. Smallpox, cholera, diphtheria, and typhoid spread rapidly through towns with no sanitation. Vaccines existed for smallpox, but supply was inconsistent, and storage methods made many doses ineffective. Frontier doctors sometimes reused needles without sterilization, spreading more disease than they prevented. Medicine blended into quackery, with traveling salesmen hawking miracle elixirs containing alcohol, cocaine, or opium. These patent medicines numbed pain, but fueled dependence. People drank tonics daily, not realizing they were slowly damaging their organs. Local newspapers often carried advertisements for these cures, and desperate families bought them in bulk. In a society without regulatory oversight, anything could be marketed as medicine, and the results were often deadly. By the late 19th century, a few frontier doctors began adopting antiseptic methods and better surgical practices, but for most settlers, medical care remained a gamble. A doctor's arrival could mean relief, or it could mean that an illness would be made worse by bleeding, purging or dosing with poison. The legacy of Old West medicine is a record of suffering where survival often depended less on treatment and more on sheer resilience, and where the line between cure and killer was paper thin. Number 4. The rule of preachers and cults. In many frontier towns of the Old West, law enforcement was thin, sheriffs held little authority, and courts were often days of travel away. This power vacuum allowed religious leaders to step in as de facto rulers. Churches were not only centers of worship, but functioned as community halls, political arenas, and informal courts. A single charismatic preacher could dictate local customs, influencing everything from acceptable clothing to whether dances, card games, or alcohol were tolerated. These figures gained authority because religion provided a moral framework at a time when state institutions were weak, but the absence of oversight also meant abuses of power were common. Preachers could rally entire congregations to ostracize individuals who resisted their teachings. In small settlements, where survival depended on trade and cooperation, being shunned was effectively a death sentence, cut off from supplies, aid, and protection. Some communities were dominated by particularly strict or radical sects. Settlements founded by groups such as the Latter-day Saints or fundamentalist Protestant congregations created rigid rules that controlled family structures, marriages, and land ownership. In isolated places, group cohesion was enforced not just by faith, but by necessity. Rejecting the rules often meant exile. Travelers documented towns where outsiders were refused entry unless vouched for by church elders, while within the community members were fined or whipped for defying church mandates. Frontier cult-like groups also thrived on fear, using sermons that emphasized eternal damnation, divine punishment, or impending apocalypse. The lack of competing institutions made these warnings powerful tools of control, ensuring obedience without the need for formal law. Religious authority also intertwined with economic and political power. Preachers often decided who could trade, who could buy land, or who was trustworthy in matters of debt. In many mining or ranching towns, ministers acted as mediators in disputes, and their judgment carried more weight than any legal writ. At the same time, traveling revivalists swept through camps with fiery speeches, collecting money and promising salvation. For a population living in dangerous conditions, such promises were hard to resist, but they also bound individuals tighter to religious authority. Disobedience could mean not only social exclusion, but also loss of livelihood. This dynamic blurred the line between church and cult. Some communities relied on faith as their glue, but others turned it into an authoritarian system. Women especially were subject to strict codes, often being told whom to marry, how to dress, or whether they could work outside the home. Men risked violent confrontation if they questioned leadership, with some disappearing under suspicious circumstances. Reports from the era describe people leaving settlements in secret to escape oppressive religious control, while others simply vanished into the wilderness. The rule of preachers highlights how fragile freedom truly was in the Old West. Where formal government failed, faith stepped in, but without checks and balances, it became both survival mechanism and tool of domination. In such an environment, life hinged not only on weather, disease, or violence, but also on whether a sermon cast you as righteous or condemned. For anyone used to modern notions of individual rights, such a system would feel suffocating. In many towns, a single Sunday sermon held more sway over daily survival than the nearest sheriff ever could. Number 5. Myths, rumors, and fear. The frontier was shaped as much by imagination as by fact, and in many ways rumor carried more weight than official law. In a world where telegraphs were slow to spread beyond major lines and newspapers took weeks to arrive, information traveled by word of mouth, and every retelling made stories bigger, darker, and more dangerous. Outlaws gained reputations that terrified whole regions long before they ever arrived. Black Bart, for instance, robbed stagecoaches politely and without violence. Yet stories painted him as a ghost-like figure who could appear anywhere along the trails. Billy the Kid became larger than life because accounts exaggerated his kill count, fueling the idea that he was untouchable. For settlers already living on edge, the myth was often more frightening than the man. Fear also surrounded indigenous tribes, with rumors of raids spreading faster than facts. Settlements might empty overnight because someone swore they saw Comanche smoke signals, even if no attack was planned. These stories reflected the tense and violent relationships of the time, but also show how fear itself became a weapon. Communities made decisions based on what they heard whispered in saloons or at the trading posts, and many lived in constant dread of dangers that never arrived. At the same time, indigenous people themselves had to endure myths that demonized them, making peaceful contact almost impossible once reputations were established. Superstition was equally powerful. Frontier trails were dotted with places believed to be cursed canyons, where travelers disappeared, stretches of desert said to be haunted by spirits, abandoned mines where strange sounds echoed. Some of these places had natural explanations, like sudden sinkholes or poisonous gas. But without science to explain them, settlers turned them into ghost stories. A stranger appearing at dusk could be seen not as a neighbor, but as a sign of coming death. Whisper campaigns inside towns destroyed reputations. Being accused of witchcraft, spying, or theft might mean being driven out or lynched. And once a rumor stuck, clearing your name was nearly impossible. Even personal conflicts were shaped by gossip. A land dispute could be fueled into violence if enough townsfolk believed one side was dishonest. Gamblers often used rumor to scare rivals, spreading tales of deadly accuracy in duels to win psychological advantage before a card game even started. This environment made paranoia a daily reality. People lived not just in fear of attack or hunger, but in fear of words. A story could cost a man his trade, his land, or his life, and there were no courts strong enough to stop it. The Old West depended on trust for survival, trading goods, traveling in groups, relying on neighbors. But that trust was fragile and could collapse under the weight of a single rumor. In such conditions, fear was self-sustaining. Communities acted on it, people made choices because of it, and violence followed it like a shadow. Unlike today, when false claims can often be disproven in seconds, there was no easy correction, no way to undo reputational damage. The culture of rumor and myth didn't just color the history of the West, it controlled the daily lives of those who lived it, turning words into weapons as sharp as any knife or bullet. Number 6. Death and Boot Hill. Cemeteries in the Old West reveal more about the reality of frontier life than most romantic stories ever could. Almost every settlement, from mining camps to cattle towns, set aside a patch of land for burials, and these resting places were often called Boot Hill. The name carried a grim practicality. Many of the dead had been killed so suddenly, in gunfights, ambushes, accidents, or raids, that they were buried with their boots still on. Death was abrupt, violent, and common, and graves reflected that transience. Most were shallow, dug quickly with little ceremony, and marked with rough wooden planks that deteriorated within a few seasons. Because of this, countless identities were lost, and the earth itself became a mass of unmarked remains where one burial overlapped another. Funerals were rarely solemn events. In a hot climate, decomposition began almost immediately, forcing communities to dig and cover graves within hours. Bodies were sometimes wrapped in blankets instead of coffins, and in poorer camps, simply lowered into the dirt as quickly as possible. Scavenging animals, wolves, coyotes, or feral dogs occasionally unearthed shallow burials, a reminder of how fragile the line was between life and death. For towns that saw waves of violence or epidemics, cemeteries filled faster than they could be managed. Cholera or smallpox outbreaks left rows of hastily dug trenches, and mining accidents could add dozens of names to Boot Hill in a single day. The presence of death shaped community psychology. Settlers lived daily with the sight of graveyards expanding at the edge of town, a constant visual reminder that survival was uncertain. Markers for men in their 20s, or children barely a year old, were not exceptions but the norm. In many towns, Boot Hill wasn't just on the outskirts, but directly in view from the main street, reinforcing how temporary every victory and every fortune truly was. Merchants, lawmen, and drifters all walked past those markers, knowing it could be their turn the next day. Possessions of the dead rarely stayed with them. In mining camps and cattle towns, a man gunned down in a quarrel might be stripped of boots, weapons, and money before burial. Communities justified this by saying the living needed those items more, but it deepened the sense of disposability. Names faded, belongings were scattered, and the individual became just another anonymous figure, swallowed by the harsh rhythm of the frontier. Families who lost loved ones often had no way to transport remains back east, so kin were left behind in Boot Hill cemeteries far from ancestral homes. For modern eyes, accustomed to medical examiners, formal funerals, and lasting memorials, the casualness of death in the Old West is difficult to process. Life was constantly at risk from disease, violence, weather, and sheer accident, and the rituals surrounding death reflected that urgency. Cemeteries grew into hillsides of forgotten markers, their wooden boards rotting away until entire communities of the dead disappeared into the landscape. The frontier's Boot Hills became monuments not to heroism, but to impermanence, showing that in a world where survival was fragile, death was not an exception, but the defining rule.